They say power reveals who people really are. I've worn a badge for over 20 years and seen that truth play out in the darkest alleys and the brightest boardrooms, but nothing quite prepared me for the smug tyranny of the Willow Ridge HOA. It started with a knock on my door. I had just moved into the neighborhood 3 weeks ago. The house was modest, tucked in the corner of a quiet cul-de-sac with just enough of a yard to make my German Shepherd Apollo happy. I wasn't looking for drama. I wanted a peaceful space to decompress. My last assignment had ended with a high-profile bust involving dirty city officials and a lot of bad press. I wasn't just any officer. I was the chief of police for our city's department. The kind who didn't show off rank unless it served a purpose. But the woman at the door that Saturday morning had a different agenda. She was in her mid-50s, bleach blonde bob so stiff it looked lacquered in place, a hot pink visor, and a clipboard clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her name was Mrs. Karen Delsworth, self-proclaimed HOA president and part-time tyrant. "Mr. Grant," she said, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, "we need to discuss several violations." I hadn't even offered a hello before she shoved the clipboard into my chest. On it were photos of my trash cans, left out half an hour too long after pickup day, my front lawn, which had one dry patch near the mailbox, and a handwritten note about Apollo, who apparently barked once during the night last Thursday. I raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" Karen didn't blink. "The rules are rules. We have standards to uphold in Willow Ridge. Property values don't protect themselves." I smiled politely. "I'll take care of it." I could have pushed back, explained who I was, pulled rank. But that's not how I do things. You don't need a badge to handle bullies. You need patience, leverage, and the right moment. Karen left with a triumphant little strut, as if she'd just won something. I closed the door, let out a breath, and looked down at Apollo, who was sitting by my feet with his ears perked. "Guess we're not in Kansas anymore, huh, buddy?" Over the next few days, things escalated. A notice showed up in my mailbox warning of impending fines. Then came the anonymous complaints. Someone reported that my garage door was open for more than 10 minutes during the day. Another claimed I had unauthorized plants growing in my backyard. Herbs, apparently, were too bohemian for the HOA's sterile aesthetic. Still, I said nothing. I made minor adjustments, played along until the 4th week. That's when the dogs showed up. I had taken a few days off to settle in, enjoy the quiet. I was working on building a patio extension out back when I heard the growling. Apollo was inside with me, so I knew it wasn't him. I stepped onto my front porch and saw them. 2 large Belgian Malinois, leashed and barking aggressively, straining against the grip of 2 men in black polos marked HOA Security Enforcement. A third man, tall, built like he missed his calling as a bouncer, stood near a black SUV with a decal that read WRHA Compliance Patrol. Karen stood beside them, arms crossed, eyes glittering with venom. "You've received multiple citations, Mr. Grant. The HOA board has voted unanimously to initiate enforcement measures. You refuse to comply with noise regulations. Your dog is unauthorized for his breed. And now we have reason to believe you're operating a non-permitted construction zone in your backyard." I blinked. "You're threatening me with dogs." The bouncer-looking guy grinned. "These boys are trained for compliance extraction. You don't want trouble." Apollo growled low behind me, sensing the tension. I didn't restrain him. "You need to step back," Karen barked, flinching at Apollo's presence. "This isn't negotiable." I took a slow step forward. "Karen," I said, "you don't have the authority to bring trained animals onto private property. You're not law enforcement. These aren't city-contracted officers. And if those dogs step foot on my lawn again, you'll be liable for trespassing and endangering a resident." Her lips curled. "Oh, please, who's going to stop us?" I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my wallet, and flipped it open. My badge gleamed in the sunlight. "I am." Silence. The men with the dogs shifted uncomfortably. The grinning guy stopped grinning. Karen's eyes widened, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I'm Chief Nathan Grant," I said. "I've spent 2 decades in law enforcement. I know exactly what's legal and what is. You just attempted to intimidate a resident with aggressive force. You issued illegal citations and you stepped beyond your chartered jurisdiction. You have no right to enforce any of this. And if you or these clowns show up at my house again, it won't be with a conversation. It'll be with a subpoena." Karen's voice wobbled. This is a misunderstanding." "No, Karen, this is abuse of power." I turned to the bouncer guy. "You're not licensed security. If you were, you'd know better than to use dogs without municipal authorization. I suggest you all leave before I decide to press charges." They backed off slowly, dragging the snarling dogs with them. Karen stammered something about calling the board and waddled back to the SUV. I stood there until they drove off, my heart pounding. Apollo came to my side, sitting tall, watching the road. "Looks like we've got more work to do," I said to him quietly. Because that little show of force, that was just the tip of the iceberg. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The silence after their retreat didn't last long. By Monday, a new letter arrived, this time in a crimson envelope, sealed with a gold sticker bearing the Willow Ridge HOA insignia like it was the royal crest of some miniature dictatorship. Inside was a formal summons to a mandatory disciplinary hearing, scheduled for Friday evening at the community clubhouse. The tone was smug, legalistic, and designed to intimidate. They wanted a wars. I didn't rise to it, not yet. Instead, I made it my mission to learn everything I could about the HOA structure. I wasn't going in blind. The bylaws weren't on their website, big red flag, but I got a copy from a quiet, soft-spoken neighbor named Rosa, who worked nights as a nurse, and seemed relieved someone was finally questioning the board. She met me by her mailbox that evening, eyes darting toward the security cameras mounted on every corner like vultures. "They find me for every little thing," she whispered. "My kid left a toy on the porch overnight and I got charged $50. When I tried to contest it, Karen told me if I didn't like it, I could leave." "You ever attend a board meeting?" I asked. She shook her head. "They say residents are welcome, but the door's always locked. No agenda posted, no notes. They make decisions behind closed doors." Exactly what I needed to hear. I went back to my house and spent the next 2 days combing through the HOA's governing documents. They were a goldmine of overreach, misused authority, and procedural violations. The board wasn't just power-hungry, they were sloppy. They hadn't held a legitimate public election in 5 years. The president's term was only supposed to be 2. They made up fees that weren't in the bylaws and funneled security costs to a company called Ridge Protection Solutions, a company registered to none other than Karen's nephew. It was corruption hiding in plain sight. Friday came. I didn't wear my uniform, I didn't bring Apollo, I wanted them to underestimate me again. The clubhouse was a sad little building near the tennis courts, painted beige with green trim like every other structure in Willow Ridge. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed above a folding table where Karen sat flanked by 2 other board members, Douglas, an ex-insurance adjuster with a chip on his shoulder, and Lorna, a woman whose entire personality seemed built on passive aggression and lavender cardigans. A 4th chair sat empty, probably meant for a token resident representative who never actually showed. The moment I walked in, the room quieted. A few residents sat off to the side, most of them wearing that beaten-down look I'd seen in witnesses too afraid to testify. Karen didn't smile. "Mr. Grant, you're late." I wasn't, but I didn't bother correcting her. She gestured to a chair opposite the table. "Please be seated. This is an official disciplinary hearing under HOA Clause 14.7. You've been accused of multiple violations including unauthorized pet ownership, construction without permit, and threatening HOA personnel." "Are you recording this?" I asked calmly. Karen blinked. "No, that's not standard procedure." "Then I will." I pulled out my phone and set it on the table. "For transparency, I'm sure you don't mind." Douglas shifted uncomfortably. Lorna glanced at Karen. Karen forced a smile, "As long as it's not distributed publicly." "I'm a public official, I know the law," I hit record. She opened a folder with dramatic flair, but I cut in before she could begin. "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws," I said evenly. "I've also reviewed municipal codes, property rights, and conflict of interest regulations, and what you're doing here, it's unlawful." Her smile faltered. "Excuse me. You're operating as a governing body, but there are no records of elections, open board meetings, or even financial transparency. You're fining people for invented infractions, using intimidation tactics, and employing unlicensed security. That's not governance. That's extortion." Lorna scoffed. "This is highly inappropriate." "No," I said, turning to the small crowd. "What's inappropriate is what happened to Rosa 3 months ago, fined for a cracked flower pot and denied a payment plan, or the marshals who were forced to remove a wheelchair ramp because it wasn't aesthetically consistent, or that veteran 2 blocks over Walter. I met him yesterday. You threatened to foreclose on his home over late dues while he was in the hospital recovering from a stroke." A few residents gasped. Walter's name had weight. Karen stood, pointing a trembling finger. "You are out of line. You don't speak for this community." I don't have to, I speak for the law. And as of now, I'm filing a formal complaint with the city attorney's office. I'm opening an investigation into ridge protection solutions, and I'm requesting a forensic audit of this board's financials. Any attempt to retaliate against me or anyone else will be considered obstruction. Karen's face turned purple. Douglas stood, sputtering, "You can't just come in here and—" "Yes, I can," I said, "because this time you picked the wrong house. I'm not scared of your dogs, I'm not scared of your made-up fines. I've taken down drug rings, corrupt politicians, and violent offenders. You think a crooked HOA is going to stop me?" Karen slammed the folder shut and stormed out. Lorna and Douglas followed like ducklings behind their queen. I turned to the residents, many of whom were now standing. "You don't have to be afraid of them anymore," I said. "But if you want things to change, you've got to be willing to fight back. I'm not here to play savior. I'm here to level the field." An older woman with a cane stood up slowly. Her name was Mrs. Carter. She lived in Willow Ridge longer than any of them. "What do we do next?" I smiled. "We take back the neighborhood." By the following week, something had shifted. For the first time in what seemed like years, neighbors were talking to each other without fear. Porch lights stayed on longer. Conversations bloomed at the ends of driveways. And those ridiculous HOA patrols, gone. The black SUV hadn't been seen since the hearing. But I knew better than to believe we won already. Bullies like Karen don't go quietly. The morning after the disciplinary showdown, I filed official paperwork with the City Housing Authority and the Department of Consumer Protection. Then I contacted a journalist I knew, Annika from Channel 6, who had a special interest in corrupt community governance. She agreed to meet me for coffee, listened closely as I laid out the evidence, then smiled. "This is going to explode." Good, that was the plan. But first, I had to get the neighborhood ready. We held the first open resident meeting at Rose's house. She offered her backyard, strung up lights, set out folding chairs. I expected maybe 10 people. 35 showed up. Even Walter came, walking slow but steady with a cane, refusing to miss it. I stood in front of the group, holding the thick binder I'd compiled with every infraction, every shady transaction, every connection between the board and their sketchy contractor cousin. "We have the power to remove them," I said. "According to Section 5 of the bylaws, residents can vote to dissolve the current board and call for emergency elections if we gather signatures from at least 60% of homeowners." Rosa raised her hand. "What if they don't accept the petition?" "They won't have a choice. Once it's signed, we can file it with the city clerk. If they ignore it, we escalate to legal action. And I already have 2 pro bono attorneys lined up." That got their attention. People were ready to act. We split into teams and canvassed. Walter's granddaughter designed flyers. The marshals offered to print everything from their home office. Even Mr. Kwon, who barely spoke above a whisper and usually avoided eye contact, joined the effort with a clipboard in hand. Momentum grew fast. But Karen wasn't done. It started small. Sprinkler systems mysteriously turned on during signature collecting. Flyers went missing from doors. Then came the anonymous letters. Rosa found one in her mailbox. "Withdraw your support. You're endangering your family." It was typed in block font, unsigned and chilling. The same day, someone slashed Walter's tires. He didn't report it. I only found out when I visited to check on him and saw the car jacked up in the driveway. "I don't want trouble," he said quietly. "You're not alone anymore," I told him. The threats told me one thing: Karen was getting desperate. I doubled my patrol presence in the area, rotated marked cruisers through the neighborhood without announcing why. Just the presence of uniformed officers was enough to spook Karen and her cronies. I saw her peek through the blinds every time a cruiser drove by. Still, they pushed back harder. A week later, I came home to a surprise. A citation nailed to my door with a piece of tape like a passive-aggressive warning. This one wasn't about Apollo, or my trash cans, or a dry patch of grass. This one was different. "You are hereby notified of an imminent foreclosure proceeding for non-payment of accumulated HOA fees." According to their records, I owed over $4,000 in fines and interest. Utterly fabricated. I took the letter inside, scanned it, then forwarded it to the attorneys, but I didn't stop there. That night, I pulled up Ridge Protection Solutions in our city's law enforcement database. What I found made my blood run cold. The business license was invalid, expired over a year ago. The supposed security officers were never registered with the state. no training records, no liability insurance. In short, the HOA had been paying thousands, likely tens of thousands, to a ghost company run by Karen's family. Worse, one of the so-called officers who brought the dogs to my door had a prior conviction for assault. He should have never been within a mile of neighborhood enforcement. The next day, I handed everything over to Annika from Channel 6. That night, she aired the story. HOA corruption exposed. Residents intimidated by illegitimate security force, forged fines, and foreclosure threats. They interviewed Rosa, Walter, even Mrs. Carter. She looked straight into the camera and said, "They ran this place like a kingdom, but we're not their subjects anymore." The backlash was immediate. My phone rang nonstop. Emails flooded in from former residents sharing their own stories. People who had been driven out, who'd sold their homes under pressure, all because of Karen's unchecked power trip. But the best part, the next morning, I opened my door to find a van parked outside the clubhouse. City auditors. They were carrying boxes, escorted by uniformed officers from the district attorney's office. Karen stood at the entrance, arms crossed, yelling at a man in a blue blazer who calmly showed her a warrant. She saw me watching, and for the first time she looked scared. But we weren't done. Not yet. The petition was still in motion. The board had to be removed legally. The power structure had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And what I was about to uncover next would burn the whole rotten thing to the ground. You never realize how deep the rot goes until you start pulling up floorboards. By the time city auditors seized the HOA's records, we had already gathered over 70% of the neighborhood's signatures. The petition to dissolve the board was a lock. Residents were done being afraid, done letting three petty tyrants dictate their lives over lawn height and paint shades. But just when we thought the worst was behind us, the investigation turned up something no one saw coming. Fraud, not just misuse of funds, full-blown embezzlement. The city found that Ridge Protection Solutions had received over $120,000 in payments over 2 years, but there were no payroll records, no invoices, no receipts, no real employees, just monthly checks signed by Karen Delsworth and cashed into an account under her nephew's name. Lorna's husband was listed as a silent business partner. Douglas, he wasn't clean either. He'd been funneling HOA maintenance contracts to a landscaping company that grossly overcharged for simple tasks, like annual foliage shaping, billed at $800 per visit. That company was registered under his cousin's LLC. It was all so brazen, so sloppily hidden, it almost felt like they never expected anyone to look. And maybe that was the truth. They had ruled this place unchallenged for so long, they'd convinced themselves they were untouchable. They weren't. When the DA's office got involved, subpoenas followed. Karen's accounts were frozen, her nephew's assets flagged. Lorna lawyered up immediately. Douglas skipped the next 2 emergency board meetings, and his car disappeared from his driveway the same day an officer showed up with a summons. The board tried to put out a statement, a last-gasp attempt at damage control, a letter delivered to each doorstep typed in bold font titled "The Truth Behind the Media Frenzy." It claimed they were victims of a smear campaign, that the audit was politically motivated, that I had fabricated evidence in a personal vendetta against Willow Ridge. I laughed when I read it, then I tacked it to my fridge like a trophy. But what happened next, that surprised even me. The very next day, Karen was arrested. Not quietly, not in the dark, right in front of the clubhouse in broad daylight, 2 detectives walked her out in handcuffs while a small crowd gathered across the street. Phones came out, cameras rolled. Karen, ever dramatic, screamed about injustice and conspiracies, but no one stepped in to help her, not even Lorna. The charges: wire fraud, misuse of community funds, filing false security claims, and orchestrating an illegal debt collection scheme. It was poetic. Rosa was the one who told me. She was watching the news with her daughter when Karen's mugshot came up on the screen. She looks smaller now, Rosa said, like all the hot air's finally gone. But even with the arrests and exposure, we still had one last job to finish: taking back the board. The community vote was scheduled for Saturday morning. The city approved it as a supervised emergency election. We'd drawn up a list of new candidates, real residents with nothing to gain and everything to protect. Walter volunteered to serve as treasurer. Rosa offered to be secretary. Mrs. Carter, Queen of Quiet Grace, put her name down for president and received a standing ovation at the meeting when she did. I declined to run. I had no interest in ruling, just in clearing the path. The day of the vote, the community center was packed. People came out early, smiling, chatting. For the first time, it felt like a real neighborhood. No one was scowling. No clipboards, no fines, no threats. By noon, the votes were in. The corrupt board was officially removed. Mrs. Carter gave a short, powerful speech. We forgot what it meant to be neighbors. Somewhere along the way, fear took root, but fear only grows in silence. And thanks to all of you, especially Nathan, we found our voices again. The applause was thunderous. Later that evening, I stood on my porch watching Apollo chase moths in the yard, the same yard that had once gotten me written up for visual clutter. Now it was full of laughing kids, blooming gardens, and people sharing meals on their porches. And just when I thought it was all finally settled, I received a call from Annika. "You're going to want to see this," she said. "There's something new, something bigger." I leaned against the doorframe, heart settling into a slow, steady rhythm. What did you find? There's another HOA just like this one. Same fake security contracts, same threats, same names popping up in the paperwork. I straightened Karen. Knows Lorna. Turns out Willow Ridge was just the beginning. And I wasn't done cleaning up. Not yet. The night breeze was cool, but I could feel my pulse warming as Annika's words sank in. There's another HOA, same scheme, Lorna's involved. I shouldn't have been surprised. People like her don't stop unless they're made to. Karen had been the loud one, the face of the operation, but Lorna, she was the quiet rot under the floorboards, always listening, always calculating. The kind of person who smiled at you while emptying your bank account with fine print. I asked Annika to send everything she had. What came through hit like a freight train. Lorna was listed on property records as a consultant for several HOA boards across the county. She used different LLCs, paper-thin entities that build neighborhoods for administrative coordination and policy enforcement consulting. But there was a pattern. Each HOA started small, harmless. Then fees went up, rules multiplied, fines exploded, and like clockwork, Ridge Protection Solutions or a variation of it would appear on their books. The same ghost contracts, the same intimidation playbook. One neighborhood even reported dogs being used to monitor compliance, just like what I'd experienced in Willow Ridge. Lorna hadn't just helped Karen steal from us. She was running a statewide racket. I forwarded everything to the DA's office, but I knew it wouldn't be fast. Lorna had already disappeared from her home. Her house was locked up, mailbox stuffed with old mail, the front flower beds dry and crumbling like no one had watered them in weeks. She was on the run. But I wasn't done yet. That weekend, I drove out to one of the neighborhoods on the list, Marigold Hills. It was about 40 minutes outside the city, a newer development built around a man-made lake. Looked like a resort brochure on the surface. Beneath it, though, the same stories echoed. A young couple had been fined $600 for hosting a birthday party with excessive outdoor noise. Their toddler had giggled too loud. Another man was told he couldn't park his truck in his own driveway because it didn't meet the community aesthetic. A retiree had her community garden torn out without notice for being unapproved flora. No one had ever seen Lorna in person. She sent everything through HOA intermediaries, puppets she controlled from the shadows. But she'd left behind traces. One of the board members, a man named Greg, thought something was off. He invited me to his house under the radar, a modest two-story place that looked identical to every other home on the block, because conformity was the ultimate currency here. I didn't know at first, he said, showing me his files. I just signed what the president told me to sign, but then I saw the numbers. Lorna's LLC, under the name Crescendo Civic Consulting, had billed Marigold Hills over $80,000 in less than 8 months. No meetings, no receipts, no verification, just automatic withdrawals from the community fund. She even charged us $400 for a policy realignment audit. Know what that was? Greg said, flipping a page. An email with the same rules, just copy-pasted with different fonts. I took his copies and promised him he wouldn't be alone when the heat came. Back home, I met with Annika again. We mapped out every HOA Lorna had touched, 11 in total, some still under her control. Others recently restructured with new shell companies taking over. The more we dug, the more we realized this wasn't a small-town scheme. This was a network. She pitched the follow-up story to her producer. They greenlit it immediately. The Hidden Empire, How One Woman Infiltrated HOAs Across the State. When the story aired, it was a wildfire. People came forward from across the region. Some had sold their homes under pressure. Others had lost savings trying to fight legal battles they didn't know were rigged from the start. A woman named Denise in Pine Hollow had even filed bankruptcy because of fraudulent restoration fees levied after she repainted her shutters without permission. The state attorney general took notice. A task force was launched. But Lorna was still missing. Until a call came in from a motel 3 towns over. A clerk recognized her from the news and tipped off local police. She was arrested without resistance. Quiet, no screaming, no drama, just a look of sour resignation on her face. She dyed her hair, worn glasses, used an alias, but she couldn't hide from everything. Especially not from truth. I was asked to testify as a witness in the investigation. So were Rosa, Greg, and dozens of others. The case built rapidly, powered by community voices that had once been silenced. The Attorney General issued a formal statement declaring a full audit of HOA enforcement policies across the state. Municipal lawmakers introduced legislation to protect residents from similar abuses, requiring transparency, election oversight, and criminal accountability for fraudulent fines. Change was happening. Real change. Back in Willow Ridge, things settled into something that almost felt like peace. Mrs. Carter ran meetings with transparency. Rosa instituted a neighborhood outreach program. Walter got a new set of tires, gifted by a community fund we built from scratch. Kids played outside again. Gardens flourished. And Apollo. He napped in the sun, leash-free, no longer a threat, just part of the neighborhood he helped defend. One evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops, Mrs. Carter stopped by my porch with a plate of cookies and a grin. "We're thinking of starting a neighborhood watch," she said, "but a real one this time, not one that spies on people, one that protects them." I nodded I'd be honored to help. Because in the end, it wasn't about badges or titles. It was about people. About standing up when no one else would. About shining light in the dark corners where abuse hides in the language of rules and standards. About saying, you don't get to decide who belongs. We do. And we choose each other.